Tonight's story is a work of folklore fiction inspired by Philippine mountain legends. Listener discretion is advised. This is Saltline Studio, a story by Mikey. The pines of Baguio did not welcome them. They simply allowed them in. Callum noticed it first, the way the mist thickened as their hired van climbed the last switchback above La Trinidad, how the temperature dropped 10 degrees in the space of a single hairpin turn. He pressed his forehead against the window and watched the world below vanish into white. The lowlands, the heat, the crowded coastal road they had followed north from Manila, all of it gone, swallowed by altitude and cloud. What remained was pine forest, dense and vertical, standing like a congregation of old priests along the roadside. "This is mad," said Priya from the back seat. She had her camera out already, filming the mist rolling between the trees. "It's like Scotland, but tropical." "Scotland doesn't smell like this," said Jess. She had the window cracked despite the cold, and the air that came through was sharp and resinous, layered with something older beneath it. Wet stone turned earth, the mineral tang of water running underground. There were 5 of them: Callum, Priya, Jess, Tom, and Leo, who was driving everyone slightly mad with his insistence on playing the same 3 songs on rotation through the van's crackling speakers. They were all 22 or 23, a year out of university, working their first real jobs in London. Leo in a studio theater off the South Bank, Priya behind a camera for a production company in Soho, Tom writing copy he hated for a firm in Canary Wharf, Jess teaching movement workshops in Peckham, and Callum. Callum played piano for other people's rehearsals and wrote songs no one had heard yet, and lived in a flat share above a kebab shop in Dalston where the ceiling leaked when it rained. The Philippines had been Leo's idea. He had read about the Panagbenga festival in Baguio, the flower festival held every February, where the streets filled with dancers and enormous floral floats and brass bands that played until the mountain air vibrated. "It's a performance city," he had told them, pacing across Tom's kitchen floor back in November, waving his phone screen at them. "It's art and altitude and flowers and fog. It's perfect." And it was. Or it would be. The festival was still 3 days away when they arrived, which meant they had the forests almost to themselves. Their rental was a wooden cabin halfway up a road called Loken, set among pines so tall their canopy was lost in the mist. The cabin had a porch that looked out over a forested ravine, and when Callum stood on it that first evening, listening to his friends argue about dinner inside, he felt something settle in him that had been unsettled for a long time. The silence here was different from London's silence. London's silence was the absence of noise. This was presence. The forest was not quiet. It was listening. The cabin itself was modest, pine-paneled walls darkened by years of wood smoke, a kitchen with mismatched plates, bedrooms divided by thin partitions that did little to muffle sound. A previous guest had left a bundle of dried sage on the windowsill, tied with red thread, and Callum noticed that the caretaker who had met them at the gate, small, quiet woman with deeply lined hands, had touched the bundle briefly as she passed, the way one might touch a crucifix out of habit rather than devotion. She had looked at the forest as she left, a long glance over her shoulder, and then she had closed the gate behind her and walked quickly downhill without looking back. Inside, Leo was already holding court, arranging sleeping assignments with the confident authority of a stage manager. Tom was unpacking groceries they had bought in the town center. Instant coffee, bread, canned sardines, eggs, a bottle of Tanduay rum that Leo had insisted upon. Jess had found a guitar hanging on the wall, dusty and slightly out of tune, and was plucking at its strings experimentally. Priya was on the porch beside Callum, but she was not looking at the forest. She was looking at him. "You all right?" she asked. "Yeah," he said. "Just listening." She nodded, as though this made perfect sense, and went inside. Priya had always understood him in a way the others did not. Not romantically. That possibility had surfaced and submerged years ago, in their second year at university, and they had both been grateful to see it go, but with the careful attention of someone who recognized a fellow observer. She filmed the world because she did not quite trust herself to be in it directly. He played piano for the same reason. He stayed on the porch longer than he should have. The cold crept through his jumper and into his skin. The pines shifted overhead, though there was no wind he could feel. Somewhere far below, in the ravine, a sound like singing, thin, high, barely there, threaded itself through the fog and was gone. Callum held his breath. He waited, but it did not come again. When he went inside, he did not mention it. They spent the next morning exploring the trails above Camp John Hay, the old American military reservation that had been turned into a sprawling park of pine walks and botanical gardens. The trails were well marked, but strangely empty, as though the forest had been reserved for them alone. Priya filmed everything. Tom narrated in the exaggerated voice of a nature documentary presenter. Leo kept stopping to stand in shafts of light that fell between the pines, posing like a Renaissance saint while Jess threw pine cones at him. It was easy, and it was good, and Callum felt, for the first time in months, that he was somewhere he was supposed to be. But the forest kept pulling his attention sideways. It was the light. It did not behave the way light should. It fell in columns through the canopy. Yes, but at the edges of his vision, it seemed to bend. Twice, he turned his head and thought he saw a brightness between the trees that was too concentrated, too warm, too deliberate to be sunlight. The third time, he stopped walking entirely. There was a woman standing among the pines. She was perhaps 30 meters away, half obscured by mist, and she was not dressed for hiking. She wore something pale and flowing that might have been a dress, or might have been the mist itself, gathered into the shape of fabric. Her hair was very long and very dark, and it did not move, despite the faint breeze that stirred the pine needles around her. Her skin, what he could see of it, seemed to hold its own light, as though she were standing in a different hour of the day than the one that held the rest of the forest. She was looking at him, not past him, not through him, at him, with an expression he could not read at that distance, but felt in his chest like a hand pressing gently against his sternum. "Callum?" Jess called from somewhere up the trail. "You coming?" He blinked. The woman was gone, not retreating, not stepping behind a tree, simply gone, as though the mist had reclaimed her. The place where she had stood looked no different from any other patch of forest floor. Pine needles, shadow, silence. He caught up with the others and said nothing, because what would he have said? "I saw a woman in the trees, and she was made of light, and she looked at me the way no one has ever looked at me." They would have laughed. They would have been right to laugh. But he could not stop thinking about her. Through lunch at a cramped restaurant in the town center where they ate bulalo, a beef bone marrow soup that warmed them from the inside out, and through the afternoon when they wandered the public market and Priya bought woven textiles and Leo tried on a tribal headdress and got politely asked to remove it, and through the evening when they sat on the cabin porch drinking San Miguel and watching the city lights flicker far below through gaps in the fog. Through all of it, the image of her persisted. Not like a memory, like a wound. That night, he dreamed he was walking through the forest, and the trees were singing, and the singing was her voice, and it was calling his name, though he had never told it to her. He saw her again the next morning. He had risen before the others and walked alone into the forest behind the cabin, following a trail that he did not remember seeing the day before. It wound uphill through thickening pines, and the further he walked, the quieter the world became. Not the quiet of absence, the quiet of attention, as though every living thing in the forest had stopped to watch him pass. She was sitting on a fallen pine at the edge of a clearing, where the mist hung low and still, like a held breath. In the daylight, she was more clearly visible, and what he saw made his throat tighten. She was beautiful in the way that old cathedrals are beautiful, not because they are trying to be, but because the scale and precision of their making overwhelms the capacity for indifference. Her face was symmetrical, but not severe. Her eyes were dark and large, and held a quality he could only describe as depth. Not sorrow exactly, but the accumulated weight of having seen a great deal and forgotten none of it. Her hair fell to her waist and moved faintly, though the air in the clearing was perfectly still. She wore the same pale garment, and up close he could see it was not fabric at all, but something else. Something that shifted between silk and vapor, catching the light in ways that cotton or linen never could. She did not seem surprised to see him. She looked up when he entered the clearing with an expression that was closer to recognition than discovery, as though she had been expecting him, or as though his arriving was simply the next thing that was always going to happen. "You came back," she said. Her voice was low and musical and carried an accent he could not place. Not Filipino, not anything he recognized, but something that belonged to the landscape itself, as though the mountain had learned to speak. "I didn't know I was coming back," he said. "I didn't know I'd been here before." "You have," she said, "in the way that rain has been to the sea. Everything returns." He sat on the opposite end of the fallen pine, leaving a respectful distance between them. The air in the clearing was different, warmer, scented with something sweet that he could not name, flowers he had no words for. The mist around them seemed to thicken at the edges, creating a boundary that felt deliberate. "Who are you?" he asked. She considered this for a long time, as though the question required more care than he understood. "I am what was here before the road," she said at last. "Before the city, before the names they gave the mountain. I was here when the pines were saplings, and I will be here when they fall. My people call me many things, but you may call me Halia. You live here in the forest?" "I live in the forest the way the river lives in its bed. The forest is not my home. The forest is me." He should have been afraid. He understood this later, replaying the conversation in the cabin while his friends slept. He should have felt the wrongness of her, the agelessness in her eyes, the way the light bent around her as though embarrassed to touch her directly, the impossible stillness of the air. But he had not felt wrong. He had felt, for the first time in his adult life, entirely seen. They talked for an hour, or for 3. Time in the clearing was imprecise, stretching and compressing like breath. She asked him about music, and when he told her that he played piano and wrote songs, her expression changed in a way that frightened him, though he could not have said why. A brightness entered her eyes that was not entirely joy. It was closer to hunger, though that word was too crude for what he saw. It was recognition. The recognition of something she had been waiting for, or mourning, or both. "Sing for me," she said. He laughed. "I haven't got a piano." Sing without it. So he did. A song he had written in his Dalston flat on a Tuesday night when the rain was coming through the ceiling, and he had felt so completely alone that the feeling had turned itself inside out and become something almost peaceful. It was not a good song by any professional standard. The melody wandered. The words were too honest, but he sang it to her in that impossible clearing, and as he sang, the mist around them began to glow, faintly, softly, as though the forest itself was listening and responding with light. When he finished, she was crying. Not dramatically, not with sound. Her tears fell like condensation forming on glass, silent and inevitable, and where they landed on the fallen pine, small white flowers bloomed instantly and then faded. "You should not have sung to me," she said quietly. "Why not?" "Because now I will remember it. And I remember everything." He returned to the clearing the next day, and the day after that. Each time, the trail was slightly different. A turning that had not been there before, a fallen tree rearranged, a stream running in a new direction, but it always led him to her. His friends noticed his absences. Tom made a joke about Callum having found a secret girlfriend. Leo expressed theatrical jealousy. Priya watched him with quiet concern, but said nothing. On the third visit, the clearing was different, larger, brighter. The mist at its edges had become something closer to a wall. Not solid, but dense, impenetrable to sight. And beyond it, barely visible, shapes that did not belong to the forest he knew. Structures, spires, the suggestion of architecture that was grown rather than built, rising from the earth in spirals of living wood and crystallized resin. "What is that?" he asked. Halia stood beside him, closer than she had been before. He could feel the warmth of her, though it was not body heat. It was the warmth of standing near a fire that burned without fuel, a radiance that came from somewhere inside her. "My home," she said, "the place between your world and the root of things. We call it the deep green. You would call it..." She paused, searching for a word that did not exist in his language. "Underneath. Can I see it?" She turned to him, and the expression on her face was one he would never forget. Desire and warning and grief, all braided together so tightly they were indistinguishable. "If you cross," she said, "you will see what no human has seen in a very long time. And the forest will know you differently afterwards. It will know your name. It will know your scent. And there are things in the deep green that do not love humans, Callum. Things that are older than I am and less kind. But you want me to see it? What I want," she said very carefully, "is something I have no right to want." He stepped through the mist. The transition was not dramatic. There was no flash of light, no lurch of vertigo. One moment he was standing in a clearing in a Philippine pine forest, and the next he was standing somewhere else, somewhere that was also a pine forest, but perfected. The trees were taller. Their bark shot through with veins of silver. The ground was carpeted with moss so green it seemed to generate its own light. Overhead, the sky was not a sky at all, but a canopy of interlocked branches so vast and intricate that it resembled stained glass. Light filtering through in colors he had no names for. The air tasted of honey and ozone and rain that had not yet fallen. And everywhere, sound. Not the random noise of a living forest, but organized sound. Harmonies rising from the roots of the trees. A deep tonal hum that vibrated in his bones. It was, he realized with a shock that nearly brought him to his knees, music. The forest was singing. It had always been singing. He had simply never been close enough to hear. "This is impossible," he whispered. "No," said Halia, who had appeared beside him. "This is what the world sounds like when it has not been made to be quiet." She showed him the deep green. "Not all of it, not even a fraction," she said, for it was larger than his mind could hold, but enough. They walked paths of polished root, through groves, where trees bore fruit that glowed like paper lanterns. They crossed a bridge made of living vines over a river that ran silver and sang in a minor key. She showed him a hall carved into the heart of an ancient pine, its walls lined with carvings that told stories he could not read but felt in his blood. Stories of the first people, the first songs, the first offerings left at the base of trees by those who understood that the forest was not a thing to be owned, but a presence to be honored. In one grove, the trees had grown into the shapes of instruments, harps, flutes, something that resembled a kulintang, the bronze gong sets he had seen in photographs of Philippine highland rituals. The wind moved through them, and they played themselves, producing music that was not random but composed, following structures and progressions that were alien to Western tonality, but emotionally legible in a way that made his chest ache. He stood among them for what felt like an hour, tears running freely down his face, and Halia watched him with an expression of such tender recognition that he understood, without her saying it, that she had once brought someone else here, that the grove of instruments was not a natural formation, but a memorial. "Who was it?" he asked. She shook her head. "A long time ago, before the Spaniards came, before the mountain had a name that was not its own. He was a musician, too." She touched one of the tree harps, and the sound it produced was older than anything he had ever heard, a single note that contained within it the memory of every song that had ever been played in this forest. "They are always musicians," she said softly. "The ones I cannot help loving. The ones who hear what others cannot." He lost track of time entirely when he asked how long they had been walking. She said, "Time does not work here the way you understand it. Minutes may have passed in your world, or hours. It is difficult to say." It was in the hall of carvings that he reached for her hand. She did not pull away. Her skin was cool and smooth, like river-washed stone, and when his fingers closed around hers, the entire forest shifted key, the low hum rising by a half step, brightening, as though the deep green itself was responding to the touch. Halia closed her eyes. "You should not have done that," she said. But she did not let go. He felt them before he saw them, a heaviness in the air, like the pressure change before a storm. The music of the forest dropped an octave, the harmonics darkening, the melodic patterns dissolving into something atonal and dissonant. Halia released his hand and stepped in front of him, and for the first time, he saw fear on her face. "They know," she said. The first was the tikbalang. It emerged from between two silver-veined pines, impossibly tall, 9 feet at least, though its proportions kept shifting, refusing to settle into a shape his eyes could hold. Its body was roughly that of a man, but its head was equine, long-skulled and dark-eyed, with a mane of coarse black hair that fell past its shoulders and moved independently, each strand seeming to possess its own awareness. Its legs were those of a horse, bending backwards at the knee, and when it moved with a terrible deliberateness, each hoofball cracking against the root path like a gunshot. It did not speak to Callum. It spoke to Halia in a language he could not understand, but could feel. A language that vibrated in frequencies below human hearing, that shook his ribs and made his vision blur. The tone was unmistakable. Accusation, outrage, ownership. Halia answered in the same language, her voice steady but strained, and the tikbalang reared back its head and screamed. A sound like a horse in agony crossed with something that might have been laughter, sharp and cruel and echoing through the silver pines until the entire forest rang with it. Then came the capre. Callum did not see it arrive. He smelled it first. Tobacco smoke, thick and acrid, laced with the sweetness of decay. Then the shadows between the trees deepened and consolidated, and a shape formed within them that was so large his mind initially refused to process it as a single being. It was darkness, given mass. A figure perhaps 12 feet tall, broad as an old oak, its skin the color of wet bark, its eyes 2 points of amber light that burned in a face half hidden by the enormous smoldering cigar clamped between its teeth. It sat in the crook of a massive pine, as though it had always been there, watching them with the patient contempt of something that had seen 1,000 intruders and outlasted them all. The Capre spoke, and its voice was the creak of old wood, the groan of roots pushing through stone. Even in its alien language, Callum understood the meaning. This forest is mine. This world is mine. You are nothing. You are a guest who has overstayed. And then, worse, the smaller ones came. Spirits without clear form, flickering at the edges of the path like candle flames in a draught. Some wore the shapes of children. Some wore the shapes of animals. Some wore no shape at all, just movement and malice, pressing closer and closer until the air around Callum became thick with whispering. His name, his fears, the secret lonely things he had never spoken aloud, offered back to him in voices that sounded almost like his own. You are not wanted. You are not worthy. She will tire of you. Everyone tires of you. You write songs no one hears, and you live above a kebab shop. And your mother calls you every Sunday and asks when you will get a real job, and you have no answer. You have never had an answer. You are nothing. Enough? Halia's voice cut through the whispering like a blade. She did not shout. She did not need to. The word carried a force that was not volume, but authority. The authority of something that had stood in this forest since before the spirits had names, since before the Tikbalang learned to stalk, since before the Capri claimed his first tree. The whispering stopped. The lesser spirits pulled back. Even the Tikbalang went still, its dark eyes fixed on her with something that might have been fear. But the Capre did not move. It took a long draw on its cigar, and the amber glow of its eyes narrowed. What passed between the Capre and Halia was not a conversation that Callum could follow. It was conducted in looks, in shifts of light and pressure, in the deep trembling of the earth beneath his feet. But he understood its shape. The Capre was issuing a warning. Halia was negotiating, and the terms, whatever they were not in Callum's favor. When it was over, the Capri exhaled a cloud of smoke that smelled of centuries and vanished into the shadows. The Tikbalang backed away, its horse eyes never leaving Callum, and disappeared between the pines with a clatter of hooves that echoed long after it was gone. Halia turned to him. Her face was composed, but her eyes were wet. You must go back, she said. What did they say? They said what I already knew, that a human cannot stay in the deep green, that your presence disturbs the balance, that if you remain, they will act within their rights, and I will not be able to prevent it. What does act within their rights mean? She did not answer. She did not need to. He returned to his friends that evening to find them frightened. Tom had gone for a walk and been lost for 4 hours on a trail that should have taken 20 minutes. He had ended up back at the cabin 3 times, always from a different direction, always certain he had been walking in a straight line. Priya had filmed a section of forest and, on playback, found that the trees in her footage were not the trees she remembered filming. They were older, denser, closer together. In one frame, barely visible in the deepened shadow, a face that was not a face, long, equine, watching. Leo had heard singing. From under the ground, he said, sitting on the porch with his knees drawn up, the color gone from his face. I swear to God, Cal, I was standing on the trail, and I could hear singing coming from under the ground, like a choir, like a church choir, buried alive. Jess had said nothing. She sat in the corner of the cabin's small lounge, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, staring at the wall. When Callum asked if she was all right, she turned to him with an expression that made his stomach drop. Something touched me, she said, on the trail. I was alone, and something... She swallowed, Something ran its fingers through my hair. From behind, there was nothing there. When I turned around, nothing, just the smell of smoke. Callum understood, then, what Halia had meant. The forest knew them now, all of them, and the things in it were not interested in hospitality. That night, he lay awake in the cabin's upper room, listening to the pines move outside the window. The others slept fitfully below. Through the thin walls, he could hear Tom murmuring in his sleep, and once, a sharp cry from Priya that subsided into silence. Outside, the mist pressed against the glass like a living thing, and in it, barely visible, shapes that circled the cabin with the slow patience of predators who know their prey cannot run. He thought about leaving, packing their bags, waking the others, driving down the mountain in the dark. But he knew, with a certainty that felt implanted rather than reasoned, that the road would not cooperate. The mountain had them. The forest had learned their names. Towards dawn, he slept. And in his sleep, Halia came to him. She stood in his dream as clearly as she stood in the clearing. But her expression was different. The warmth was still there, the depth, the impossible age in her eyes. But threaded through it now was something harder. Resolution. They will come for your friends tomorrow night, she said. The Tikbalang will lead them in circles until they are separated. The lesser spirits will feed on their fear until they cannot think. And the Capre? She stopped. The Capre has claimed the right to keep what the forest catches. It is an old law, older than me. Then help us leave. I will. But you must understand what that means. If I open a path for you, if I defy the Capre and the old laws, there will be a cost. Not to you, to me. What cost? The cost is that the path closes behind you. Permanently, the clearing will not appear. The trail will not form. You will walk these forests for the rest of your life and never find me again. And her voice faltered for the first time, I will remain, as I have always remained. He wanted to argue. He wanted to offer himself in exchange, to bargain, to negotiate some other way. But he could see in her face that there was no other way. The rules of the deep green were not human rules. They could not be bent by love or good intentions, or the desperate desire of a 22-year-old piano player from Dalston who had stumbled into something vast and beautiful and utterly beyond his capacity to hold. I don't want to leave you, he said. I know, she said. That is why I must be the one to let you go. He woke his friends before dawn. He did not tell them everything. He told them enough that the forest was not safe, that they needed to leave, that he had found a path and they had to take it now, before the sun rose and the mist burned away and whatever protection the early morning offered was gone. They trusted him. He was not the leader of their group. That was Leo, always Leo, with his theatrical confidence and his easy authority. But in that moment, in the gray pre-dawn cold of the cabin, with the shadows still circling outside, they trusted the look on Callum's face more than they trusted their need for explanation. They packed in silence. 5 minutes, bags thrown together, passports grabbed, the van keys in Leo's shaking hand. Callum led them into the forest. The path was there, as Halia had promised. It did not look like a path. It looked like a gap between the pines that was slightly less dark than the surrounding forest, a corridor of faintly luminous mist that wound downhill through the trees. But Callum could feel it. It had a pull, a gentle insistence, like a current in shallow water. Stay close, he said. Don't look to the sides. Don't stop. Whatever you hear, keep walking. They walked. the forest, resisted them. Not physically. There were no fallen trees blocking the path, no sudden walls of undergrowth. The resistance was subtler. It was the sensation of being watched from every direction. It was the way the shadows between the pines seemed to lengthen and reach, like fingers stretching across the forest floor. It was the sound, the terrible, beautiful sound of the deep green's music, rising from beneath their feet, calling to them, promising rest, promising warmth, promising that if they only stopped walking for a moment, just a moment, they would understand everything. Priya faltered first. She stopped and turned towards the trees, her eyes wide, her camera falling to her side. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. "It sounds like..." "Don't listen," Callum said. He took her arm. "It's not real. Keep walking." The tikbalang appeared twice, or its shadow did, enormous and angular, pacing them through the trees at a distance that was too close for comfort and too far for certainty. Its hoofbeats echoed like heartbeats, syncopated, relentless. Leo saw it and made a sound that Callum had never heard him make, a high, tight whimper that belonged to a much younger person. But he kept walking. The lesser spirits pressed closer. They whispered names. They whispered secrets. Tom stumbled and said, "They know about Sarah." "How do they know about Sarah?" And Jess said, "Shut up. Keep walking," in a voice that was barely holding together. And then, ahead of them on the path, the air thickened with tobacco smoke, and the Capri was there. It did not block the path. It stood beside it, leaning against a pine that bent under its weight, its enormous cigar trailing smoke that curled into shapes. Faces, hands, reaching things. Its amber eyes found Callum in the pre-dawn gray, and it smiled. The smile was worse than any threat. It was patient. It was amused. It said, without words, "You may leave, but you will carry me with you. I will be in your dreams. I will be in the smoke of every fire. I will be in the creak of every tree you ever hear again. You came into my forest, little man. A part of you stays." Callum walked past it. He did not stop. He did not look away, because something in him understood that the Capri respected refusal more than it respected fear. He held its gaze for 3 steps, 5, 7, and then the smoke parted and the path continued downhill and the Capri was behind them. They emerged from the forest onto the road. The van was where they had left it. The road was real, tarmac and gravel, and a metal crash barrier, and a road sign pointing towards Kennan Road, towards the lowlands, towards the world. The sun was just breaking over the eastern ridges, and its light was ordinary, mundane, gloriously flat and honest. Leo started the van with hands that would not stop trembling. Priya got in the back and began crying quietly. Tom said nothing. Jess put her hand on Callum's shoulder and squeezed, once, hard, and then climbed in after the others. Callum stood at the edge of the road and looked back into the forest. She was there. Not at the edge, deeper in, half hidden by the pines and the morning mist. She stood very still, her pale garment barely distinguishable from the fog, her hair falling around her like dark water. She did not wave. She did not call out. She simply stood and watched him with those old, deep, impossible eyes. And in the space between them, the 10 meters of pine needle and shadow that separated the road from the trees, Callum felt the last thread of the connection stretch and thin and hold. He raised his hand, a small gesture, not a wave, an acknowledgement. She inclined her head, just slightly, and then the mist thickened around her. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the slow inevitability of a door closing on well-oiled hinges. And she was gone. He got in the van. Leo drove. They did not speak. For the first hour, they flew home 3 days later. They did not return to Baguio. They spent the remaining time in Manila, in the heat and noise and relentless human density of the capital. And none of them complained about the traffic or the humidity or the crowds, because all of it was real and solid and blessedly, mercifully ordinary. They did not discuss what had happened. Not properly. Not in the way that would have required them to admit that the world was larger and stranger and more dangerous than they had been taught. Tom made a joke about it on the plane home. Something about enchanted forests and Tolkien, and the joke fell flat, and no one tried again. Priya deleted the footage from the forest. She did not explain why. Callum did not ask. Weeks later, she would tell him, over coffee in a Brixton cafe, speaking carefully, as though selecting each word from a tray of delicate objects, that she had watched the footage once, in her hotel room in Manila, and that the footage had watched her back. That in the final frame, captured in the deep shadow between two pines, something with amber eyes had been looking directly into her lens. She had felt, she said, that it could see her through the screen, that it knew she was watching, that it was smiling. She had not picked up her camera for 2 weeks after that. When she did, she found that the forests and green spaces she used to love filming, Hampstead Heath, Epping Forest, the small wooded park near her flattened crouch end, made her hands shake. This passed. Eventually. Most things do. But she never filmed pine trees again. Jess cut her hair short when they got home. She said it was for a new workshop she was developing. Something about transformation and letting go. But Callum knew. He had seen the way she flinched when Tom absent-mindedly reached over to brush a strand from her face at dinner. The memory of invisible fingers in her hair was not something a new hairstyle could excise. But the gesture helped, and Callum respected its logic. You cannot undo what has been touched, but you can change the shape it touched. Leo, who had always been the loudest and most unshakable of them, became quieter, not dramatically. He still performed, still held rooms, still walked into parties like a man who expected the music to start when he arrived. But something behind his eyes had dimmed or deepened, and on the rare occasions when the five of them were together afterwards, less often now, the intervals growing longer, the way they do, when a shared experience is too large to be comfortable. Callum would catch Leo looking out of windows at nothing, his expression far away, listening for something that was no longer there. Back in London, life resumed its shape. Leo returned to his theater. Priya picked up her camera. Tom went back to writing copy he hated. Jess taught her workshops. The rhythms of the city reasserted themselves, and the memory of Baguio retreated to the place where all impossible things go when the mortgage is due, and the tube is delayed, and the world insists on being explicable. But Callum was different. He knew it. His friends knew it, though they could not have named what had changed. He was quieter, but not in the way of someone who has been diminished. In the way of someone who has heard a piece of music so perfect that all other sound requires a period of adjustment. He went back to his flat above the kebab shop. He sat at his piano, and for 3 days, he did not play. On the 4th day, he began to write. The song that came out of him was not the song he had sung in the clearing. It was something new, something that carried. In its melody and its intervals and its careful, aching silences, the memory of a forest that sang, and a woman who was not a woman, and a world beneath the world where time moved differently, and love was a thing that could bloom and be released in the same breath. He played it once, alone, in the middle of the night, with the rain coming through the ceiling and the smell of kebab grease rising through the floorboards. And when the last note faded, He sat in the silence that followed and let himself feel it. All of it. The wonder and the loss and the gratitude and the grief, without trying to make it smaller than it was. He never went back to Baguio. He never looked for the clearing. He understood, with a certainty that was not intellectual but cellular, that the path was closed and would remain closed, and that this was the price of his survival, and his friend's survival, and the only gift he could offer in return for everything she had given him. But sometimes, on cold mornings, when the air in London carried that particular mix of dampness and pine, from the trees in Victoria Park, from the wreaths at Christmas, from the cleaning products in the corner shop that smelled, if you caught them at the right angle, exactly like a Philippine mountain forest at dawn, he would stop. He would close his eyes. And for a moment, just a moment, he would hear it. The singing, thin, high, barely there, the forest, remembering him. The pines of Baguio do not mourn. They are too old for mourning, too rooted, too patient. They have watched 1,000 seasons turn, and 1,000 mists descend, and 1,000 fires burn in the valleys below, and they have remained. Remaining is what they do. It is all they know. But Halia is not a pine. She stands in the clearing that no human trail will ever find again, in the place between the world and the root of things, and she does not weep. She has wept already. The flowers that bloomed where her tears fell have grown into a small garden at the base of the fallen pine, white and fragile and persistent, and they will bloom there for 100 years. The tikbalang watches from the edge of the trees, cautious. The capre smokes in silence, far above, a point of amber light among the highest branches. The lesser spirits drift and whisper, but quietly now, chastened by what they witnessed. An encantada, one of the ancient ones, choosing loss over possession, choosing the human's freedom over her own desire. It is a thing they do not understand, but they respect it in their way. Even the old laws bend, just slightly, in the presence of such choosing. Halia closes her eyes and listens. Very far away, impossibly far across oceans and continents and the immeasurable distance between what is seen and what is real, a young man sits at a piano in a flat above a kebab shop in East London and plays a song about a forest. She hears it. She will always hear it. The mist thickens. The pines lean close, as they have always leaned, sheltering what they can. The clearing glows faintly, briefly, with a light that is not sunlight and not moonlight, but something older and more tender, and then it fades. She opens her eyes. She straightens. She turns towards the deeper forest, towards the silver-veined pines, and the singing rivers, and the vast, quiet, patient architecture of a world that has no need for roads or names or explanations. She walks forward. She does not look back. But the forest remembers. The forest always remembers. You've reached the end of tonight's tale, but not the end of the forest. Some stories do not fade when the telling stops. They wait. If this world felt close to you tonight, there are others. Other mountains, other roads, other things that watch from the trees. This is Saltline Studio, and the forest always remembers.